Well, good morning, everyone. I trust you're doing well this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're coming from today. Just wanted to welcome you to the last installment of this series that we've done entitled Road to Continuous Improvement. And I hope you've gotten as much out of this as we had hoped you would. And we'll continue to do some of these webinar series in the future, maybe even repeat this one. And go into a little bit more in depth with various elements and how to apply your knowledge and experience to continuously improve your process safety in your facilities. Today's topic will be both compliance audit and trade secrets. Since trade secrets fairly small, we can combine it into the one entitled today as compliance audit and trade secrets. So let's just get into this right away. Really, for the most part, let's look at the regulation as we always do. It talks about the employers shall certify. We're talking now about compliance audits. It says the employer shall certify that they have evaluated compliance with the provisions of this section at least every 3 years, and to verify the procedures and practices developed under the standard are adequate and are being followed. I think the key thing to remember in this particular one is the employers shall certify. And what may want to talk about this a little bit later on. I've had several conversations with colleagues and some clients this week regarding what does that really mean? Well, it really means the employer shall certify. So we'll talk about that maybe in a little bit more detail here later on. The next part is a compliance audit shall be conducted by at least one person knowledgeable in the process. So somebody with process knowledge. Next thing is a report of the findings of the audit shall be developed. Next thing is the employer shall promptly determine and document any appropriate response to each of the findings of the compliance and document that deficiencies have been corrected. And the last here is the employer shall retain the 2 most recent compliance audit reports. So when we talk about the regulatory piece of trade secrets, it really says the employer shall make all information necessary to comply with this section available to those persons responsible for compiling the process safety information, those assisting in developing the process hazards analysis, and those responsible for developing the operating procedures, and those involved in incident investigations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really, when it comes down to trade secrets, the only thing that's you can actually do here, and we'll talk about this as well in a little bit more detail, is you can't withhold any information from your employees. You must provide all of that information for them, period. The only thing this allows you to do is essentially stamp documents as trade secrets when it comes to providing information to outside sources such as regulatory personnel from OSHA or EPA, and that allows them to not provide that information in a FOIA request or a Freedom of Information request from the public. So the other part of trade secrets is nothing in the paragraph precludes the employer from requiring persons to whom the information is made available under the paragraph of P1 that we just discussed to enter into confidentiality agreement. So it doesn't mean your employees or employers can't require you as an employee to sign a confidentiality agreement. And as such, this allows them to do that. Also, subject to the rules and procedures set forth in 1200, through employees and their designated representatives shall have access to trade secret information contained within the process hazards analysis and other documents. So essentially telling me again, your employees have access to all of that information, including hazardous consequences, hazardous information, et cetera. So what is the purpose and the intent of both of these portions or both of these elements within PSM? Well, first is to identify weaknesses or gaps in your process safety. And that's first and foremost, that's what it is looking for those gaps that you have in your process safety. And of course, that includes looking for and identifying areas of improvement. Remember, PSM is all about continuous improvement. So you never arrive to where you're trying to get. It's one continuum all the way through, continuing to get better at what you do. It's to reduce and eliminate process safety events and incidents. At the end of the day, that's what we're trying to achieve. It also is for communication and awareness of process safety culture. The more we're communicating process safety information, the more we're enhancing that process safety culture, that culture of safety in general. And when we hide information or when we don't continuously get better, we don't communicate with our employees, we don't work with our employees to make things better, we never will, and things actually get worse. So when it comes down to trade secrets, it's defined how that trade secret information is communicated and handled. Are we keeping everything in a lockbox and not sharing any of that information with the employees? And we should all know by now that if we keep knowledge to ourselves, then we'll never get better from a process safety standpoint, never get better as a process, never get better as a business for that matter. We need everybody engaged in the process. So these are some of the gaps that, again, that we see as part of the compliance audits that we do. For the most part, the number of areas that we see deficiencies in compliance audits is really much less than in general in terms of all of the other elements that we looked at before. But still, about 37% of the audits that we look at is failure to document the appropriate response to each of the findings in a timely manner. So this is a matter of going out and actually having someone or somebody do the compliance audit, but not following up with the recommendations. They're just in an audit report and nothing has been done. In some cases, we see no report at all. They may have a document that says that we did a compliance audit on such a date, but there's no report. There's nothing to look at the scope, nothing to determine whether or not they've actually done the audit or not. How you find this information out is interview of audit personnel. You can you can interview those people just as well as you can interview operators, etc. The thing that you're looking for is knowledge of the requirements and application. So during interviews, are we looking for knowledge of those people that are doing the audit, that they really knew what they were looking for and how to apply what they were looking for? Or did they just go through a checklist and ask somebody the question and the person responded yes or no, and they went on and didn't really dig into whether or not they had the knowledge of the application of that particular element or not? The next thing is failure to certify compliance, 29% of the time. This is just not a letter or statement, but it should be evidence. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we'll see compliance audits have a letter in there and say, I certify that we've done this audit. But yet during the audit, you find all kinds of gaps. That is a good indication that they only certified that the audit was done. They didn't certify that it was thorough and complete. And that's really what we should be looking at. It's really evidence that we've actually did a thorough job of that audit. And not just certifying that it was done or that somebody did it for you. It's failure to complete an audit every 3 years. And we still see this about 27% of the time where we may have an audit that was done in June of one year and not done until August, September of the next. Well, they're required to be done every 3 years. And if there's some evidence or some logical reason why it was delayed 3-4 months, then that's perfectly fine. But what we normally see quite often is it may be done June of this year or June of 6 years ago in June. The next 3-year cycle, it was done in August. The next year cycle, it was done in December. So at some point in time, they're going to miss a 3-year cycle. So because they keep pushing it out 3 or 4 months every time. So I recommend that everyone develop a schedule for compliance audits and stick to that schedule. So if you're over a month or two, that's fine. Well, the next one that you come about to do, make sure that you're back on schedule to get it done when it should be done. For those that are going past that time 3 years, make sure you're documenting as to why. Some facilities will actually start the compliance audit in the right month and not finish it for, say, a month and a half later. That's fine too, as long as you're making good progress towards completing it or getting that final report done. Again, it's all about document. It's all about making sure that you're following your own guidance on how you plan to get those done, and that they're done at least every 3 years. Again, the last one we have here is failure to address all elements at least every 3 years. We have a number of clients that will actually do a compliance audit annually. So they do a third of the elements 1 year, a third of the elements the next year, and the rest of the elements the following year, and then keep on that cycle. And that's perfectly fine as well. As long as you're addressing compliance at least every 3 years, you can certainly do that. It just helps in some cases on people have limited number of auditors, et cetera, or people within their own facility that go into other facilities to do those audits. Certainly that can be done as well. Remember, the audit process is determined if there are any weaknesses or gaps, like we said earlier, but also gaps in your management system. And that's essentially what we're looking for, is what kind of gaps do you have in your management system in general? And what methods are you taking to correct those gaps? And remember, these actions can prevent catastrophic release, injury, and death. And that's the ultimate goal, obviously, of process safety management. So some of the best practices that I see, and certainly I encourage you to ask questions as we're going through this, so that we can make sure that we're addressing all of those things within your audit that need to be reviewed and discussed. But some of the best practices that we see quite often are to provide appropriate guidelines for auditing. Normally, we like to see facilities create some type of policy or procedure on what you're going to do for your audit. Maybe that's develop your own checklist, your own protocol on what are those things that you're looking for. What constitutes compliance? What does not constitute compliance? What are some of those best practices? What are some of those things that we can put in place that would help us to improve? They may not be a compliance issue, but they may help us to get better from a process safety standpoint. A lot of our protocols, we have within our protocols best practice questions. We also have questions that will solicit better responses or solicit more knowledge be gained by those people that we're auditing. And those are the things that we're looking at as well. Also define PSM elements to be audited. So if we're going to be splitting those audits up by element for the specific people within the audit, or even over a period of time, say like we talked about earlier, say if we're only going to audit a third of the elements every year, then define which of those elements will be audited. The other thing is define the minimum requirements. And what I mean by that is a lot of facilities may, of course, we would expect that they define not only the design codes and standards, but also the inspection codes and standards that they're using, so that we can look at what the minimum requirements are for each of those reg gaps that they have chosen, and then hold them to those standards. A lot of times, as part of the audit, we'll look at those minimum requirements, and based on the risk that that facility may be exposed to, we may suggest in those that audit that they look at a different reg gap to reduce their exposure to not only liability, but also to the risk of their own employees. The next thing is train audit personnel. And believe it or not, there's a lot of people that do compliance audit that have not had the training to do the compliance audits. And that's probably why we still see the gaps that we see in a lot of the audits that we do, is because previous audits didn't look at it from a standpoint of implementation. They looked at it from a standpoint of regulatory requirements and checking the box. And when you're just checking the box, believe me, the underlying intent and purpose of the regulation itself was not applied. And if that's what we're trying to just achieve regulatory compliance and not improve your process safety, then obviously you're probably good. But if you want to improve process safety, then you need to be looking at actually implementation of those various elements, intent and purpose. We always recommend, obviously we're a little bit biased here, and of course we understand that. We recommend that you use qualified third-party auditors. A lot of facilities, if you have only one facility, doing an internal audit would probably not fit or pass muster when it comes to the fact that you do not have financial responsibility. Obviously, there's a lot of facilities. What we mean by that, there's a lot of facilities that may have an internal auditor that may be biased. Well, I don't want to put this on the report because it'll require them to spend money to fix those issues. That's where third parties really don't have any skin in the game when it comes to financial responsibility, so they can look at those items more objectively. Obviously, you can, as a facility, you can disagree or agree to a finding, and you can address that finding to fit your needs. But on the other hand, don't let it be swept under the rug because of money, because I will guarantee you those things will cost you more in the long run than they do in the short run. Review the last two audit findings and recommendations. I think those are so important from the standpoint of not only is it required to have the last two, but it also paints the picture of where you're going. So if you look at the last two audits and the same items are coming up every time, or when you're doing your audit of the facility, you're seeing repeat items, then you know you have a culture issue. You know you have other issues that you're going to have to address. So in those cases, what happens if you have a lot of repeat items, that tells you that the facility is just going through the motions, going through the requirements of just getting the things done and not addressing the underlying issues that keep those items keep those items reoccurring. Always focus on implementation of the PSM. Now, what I mean by that is just don't look at do they have a element? Do they have a procedure? Well, have they actually put that procedure into practice? Are they actually following those policies and procedures that they have developed? Making sure that the book on the shelf is just not creating dust. If that book on the shelf is dusty, you have a pretty good idea that it's not being implemented. It is just going through the motions. Often, one of the things that I see quite often is employee participation comes down to attending meetings. A meeting is not participation. A meeting is attendance, but it's not participating. On the other hand, if the meeting itself was being led by somebody within that organization, an operator, et cetera, training on an operating procedure, training on a specific element of PSM, then that is participation. What we want to be able to do is make sure that our employees are participating in the whole process safety process. The way we determine that, through interviews. Do your employees, for example, have the knowledge that they need to have? Just the basic knowledge. A lot of times it depends on the facility as to whether or not what type of level of knowledge they have in process safety. In some cases, the interview may start out, do you know what PSM or process safety management is? If they don't have a clue, then you start asking some other questions regarding operating procedures, PHAs, and process safety information to try to determine whether or not they have any knowledge where that information is kept or what any of that means to them. If they don't, then you know you have a employee participation gap that needs to be addressed. So in some of the bigger facilities, obviously, if you're in ammonia refrigeration, you're not going to do this next one. You're probably looking at all of the equipment. But in some bigger facilities, what we normally do is select about 10% of the vessels, 10% of the piping circuits, and about 10% of critical controls or critical instruments, et cetera. We look at procedures, inspections, and tests on every one of those that we select. And what we're looking for is systemic issues. We're not looking for like a mistake or a one-off sort of issue. We're looking for things that would indicate that your management system is broken or needs to be revised or fixed. And that's what we're looking for. So if we take 10% of your vessels, let's say you have 100 vessels in your facilities, you have 1,000 circuits, we're just going to look at 10% of those. That gives us a pretty good idea as to whether or not you have bigger issues. So if you have 100 vessels and out of those 100 vessels, we select 10% of them. And out of that 10%, we have another 10% essentially where we find issues with deficiencies in inspections, frequencies, inspection results, procedures. Then we can extrapolate that out into your whole process onto how much of an issue and how much of a gap that you have in process safety. Each element should be viewed from an implementation standpoint. Again, we think that's so important that if we're not looking at it from an implementation standpoint, we've really missed the point of process safety altogether. Out of those critical controls, we typically will select safeguards from the PHA. And what we mean here is when you go back to your PHA, your PHA will have a scenario, and that scenario will have some consequence. So the consequence will result in something hazardous. For example, it could be exposure of your personnel, fatality, could result in major injury, could result in major destruction of property, etc. So those are the things that we're looking for. Now we're looking for the safeguards that you have in place to protect you from that particular scenario, or how to protect your employees from that particular scenario. That safeguard might be something like a high pressure shutdown. It could be a high temperature shutdown. It could be some other interlock or some other device that outside of a relief valve, et cetera, that you have in place to address that particular scenario. We would select those and ask for the testing, inspection procedures, and then all the results of inspections and testing and procedures. For the most part, most of those will be required to be tested at least annually, and along with the procedure to indicate how that testing is performed. If that particular safeguard has some additional, let's say that, let me go back here. Let's say that that scenario has more than one safeguard. Maybe you have two interlocks that address that particular scenario. Based on the risk, it may require that those both be tested at least annually to achieve your risk reduction. So that's what we're looking for. Those items were added to your PHA to address risk reduction, and therefore they need to be tested and inspected on some frequency. That could be also outlined in your MI policy and procedure on how often they should be inspected and tested. Remember, you have the ability to write those policies and procedures, and that's what you would be essentially held to during an audit. We're going to interview, and you should interview employees for participation, operating procedure being correct, and procedures are in place. So one of the things you can certainly ask your operators is, are they involved in reviewing procedures to make sure that they're correct and up to date? If you have a manager that's signing off on or certifying that the procedures are correct and up to date, then you want to interview that manager, especially if you can find some portions of the procedure that are not correct and up to date. That's where you find that information is during an interview. A lot of times in an interview, I will already have determined that there's procedures not in place for certain specific tasks that are done in a facility. One example that I see quite often is changing filters. Maybe it's changing a hose or something like that. And during an interview, I will ask, do you have a procedure for doing that task? That should require an SOP. Now, who is certified that that SOP was complete, or if there's no procedure in place, et cetera, for those tasks. The next thing is looking for training records and verification of understanding. And what I mean by that is are your employees being trained, for example, on management of change items? So there's a change in your process, a change in your SOP. Have your employees, have your operators been trained in that specific change? Has there been some type of verification of understanding provided? And what we mean by that is some type of quiz or some type of verbal response or some documentation showing that they understood that change and what that change meant. And can they show you exactly what that change entailed? Again, you can pick that information up in an interview of that contractor, or I'm sorry, of that operator. The next thing is contractor qualification and verification of training. How many contractors do you have coming in your facility that you cannot verify that they've actually had their training? So a lot of times there's a lot of people that use third parties to take care of their contractor management. Even in those cases, can you verify that they've had the training? The only way you can do that, and a lot of times, is interview those contractors. And I will guarantee you, if you went through our contractor management portion of this, a lot of times they cannot verify that they even know where the muster points are, or the rally points in the case of an incident. One thing that we see quite often is hot work. A lot of facilities will bring in contractors for hot work. Those contractors must have a fire watch provided if you don't provide that fire watch yourself. Again, the contractor needs to provide somebody who's qualified to be a fire watch. They have to have the training, and we need to verify that they understood that training so that they can do the job that they're required to do correctly. The next thing is PHA and compliance audit action items completed in a timely manner. That's one that quite often gets missed. A lot of facilities will do the PHAs, they do the compliance audit, but then don't follow up with the action items in a timely manner. Again, timely manner is subjective, and I know there's been some court rulings regarding what timely manner means, but for the most part, we should be addressing those compliance audits, PHA action items in a process. In other words, don't have the compliance audit done and then a year later we decide to do those. That means we've taken no action. On the other hand, we can have actions that take time, they take a process, but we should be updating that information as we go along. The next thing is are incidents investigated? Actual incidents and near misses, are they being investigated the way they should? One thing that I will always ask on every one of my compliance audits, especially when it comes to the facilities outside of ammonia refrigeration, I will ask, have you ever had a relief valve that is listed in your process? If there's been a relief valve that is lifted, that would be at least a near miss, if nothing else. And because there should be follow-up that should be done in those cases. So we're looking for those type of incidents that make sure that if it's outside, if it's intended place, it's needs to be investigated accordingly. Determine if the MOC program is working. For example, some of the things that you can look at are their P&IDs correct and up to date? If their P&IDs in part of your walk down should include a portion of P&IDs as part of your compliance audit. If you're finding issues with P&IDs, then that would also mean that your MOC program is probably not working the way it should. Are your PSSRs being done the way they should be done to determine whether or not your MOC process is working as well? So there's a number of things that you can determine just by doing that initial walkthrough, walk down of P&IDs, et cetera. So these are some of the typical serious OSHA citations, and these are still the number ones as we go throughout the years. They kind of all stayed the same, maybe one or two flip around, but for most part, this is what we see quite often, is failure to maintain and follow normal operating procedures. Now, part of my interviews, I will always ask the operators a question: do you use the operating procedures or refer to them when needed? Most answers, and the answer I would expect, is refer to them as needed. However, I also follow up with the question of which procedures do you use the most often? The answer we should expect is those things that we don't do very frequently. You know, obviously, if we only change a filter out every year or twice a year, maybe we're expecting the operator to have a good procedure to follow in those cases, since we don't do those very frequently. If we don't have good written procedures for them to follow, then those are areas likely to make mistakes. Just a little something off subject here a little bit. I noticed a couple of weeks ago that I read an article where some Southwest airline pilots had said that the reason they were making some mistakes is because they haven't flown as much as they normally would because of the pandemic. Some were 2 or 3 months before they had flown the previous time, and they were making mistakes like forgetting to ask for clearance before they land. One of the reasons they said they were making those mistakes is they've kind of lost the edge because they haven't done it in a while. Well, just think, that's flying an airplane with all of these checklists that they should have in place and everything else. Just apply that to your facility. If your operators are not doing a task for 6 months to a year, and they do not have good written procedures to follow, or they're not expected to follow those procedures when they haven't done those tasks in a while, then we certainly have areas for improvement in our process safety. Also, is failure to develop and implement inspection and testing procedures for ongoing MI of the process equipment. If you do not have written procedures, then certainly you're setting yourself up for process safety events in the future for sure. Also, failure to provide refresher training to process operators. Refresher training can take a lot of different forms and shapes, but certainly going over your operating procedures, going over those tasks that they don't do that frequently. Part of that refresher training should be included in that, but also making sure that that refresher training is on the latest and greatest procedures and how you perform those tasks, and getting that input from those operators to make sure that we're doing those things in the correct way, and updating the SOPs or your procedures as needed. Next thing was failure to correct deficiencies in process equipment in a safe manner. A lot of times you can have inspections and tests that will show deficiencies in equipment, but nothing has been done. One of the areas I see this quite often is facilities that use third parties for doing inspections and tests of their equipment. The report will come back, and then the report is either filed somewhere, but then the information, the recommendations to address the deficiencies are never taken care of. So when you have that disconnect between the two, the third party and your own facility, that's where some of those gaps can form, and those need to be addressed. Failure to provide necessary training to emergency responders. That one's pretty self-explanatory, that, you know, if you're going to respond, especially if you're going to respond to a leak or spill in your facilities, making sure that you are HAZWOPER trained or have the correct training to do those, make those responses is important. Failure to address the hazards in the process, or PHA. A lot of times within all of our facilities, doesn't matter what type of facility you're in, there are going to be hazards that are common throughout our facilities or industries. Taking that information and applying it to your facility is important. So we just don't want to make ourselves a cocoon around our facility and not be able to address those particular issues within our own facility, even if it's to say that does not apply to us. We need to be able to take knowledge that others have learned and apply it to us as well. That's what helps us to get better. And of course, failure to perform audits is required every 3 years. And this one's fairly high on the list of OSHA PSM citations. I want to caution us a little bit on this list. And I tell people this all the time, that when you look at this list from OSHA, to me, represents low-hanging fruit. And what I mean by that is these are easy things to find for OSHA PSM inspector. The things that are harder to find, you don't see on this list. For example, it's easy to ask somebody, do you have a procedure for testing, inspection, and safeguard? It's a little bit more difficult to understand what are safeguards, what inspections and tests should be done, what should those results look like. This is what I mean by digging deeper, making sure we're applying process safety knowledge to what we're doing, not just following through, making sure we have the documents in place, but actually implementing what we know we need to do to achieve process safety. Other things to consider: is there evidence that an effective process safety management program has been set up with explicit expectations, objective goals, with clear-cut desired outputs? That's what we're looking for. Have resources been provided in the form of personnel assigned to provide implementation and continued improvement of each element? Have clear lines of responsibility been established with roles and responsibilities assigned? We talked about this as the first element of a good process safety management program, is developing that RACI, who's responsible, accountable, who should be consulted and informed. Is management committed to using all the available resources for enhancing process safety knowledge at all levels of the organization? And do they clearly demonstrate that by actions? And that's what we're looking for. Good interviewing, good auditing, and we'll bear that out. You will see that readily through a good audit. Does management encourage active participation in professional and trade organization for key PSM personnel to ensure PSM systems keep pace with best practices? And that is so key, is getting involved in other organizations, getting involved with other entities within your industry as well. It can be helpful. Maybe joining the API and being on a committee, joining IIR and some of those committees, and being involved. But just like us or me as a consultant, I get to go into numerous facilities conducting audits, conducting process hazards analysis, conducting MI audits, and helping people get better at developing a good process safety culture. As part of that, I get to see the good, the bad, the ugly. And you know, one of the things I take out of that is when I go into the ugly, it's a good thing because they've invited me in to help them to get better, to help them to get to the good. Obviously, one of the things I focus on when I'm in the ugly is I focus on what are the things that we need to start with as a minimum. You know, you can't eat the elephant in one bite. You have to take it one bite at a time, right? So just taking those first few steps to get you where you need to be. So the last thing I want to discuss, and then we'll get into some of these questions, is does the process have any trade secrets? And that's what we're going to talk about. Trade secrets is the last thing here. First of all, I see so many times people will mark certain things as trade secrets when they're not. For example, I have been into a number of facilities and I ask for the lockout tagout procedures and they will mark them trade secrets. Those are not trade secrets. So we need to make sure we understand what a process trade secret is. And then are those trade secrets clearly documented so that we understand that they are a trade secret, a formula, et cetera, that you might use it in your process, et cetera, that could very well be a trade secret. But all employees, regardless whether you call it or not, they have access to all of that. You need to make sure your employees have access to all of that information. I went into a couple of facilities where they said our employees don't have access to that because it's a trade secret. I'm sorry, they need access to that, okay? Because it is a process safety, that is their role in the facility. They need to have access to that information. So I'm going to ask or answer some of these questions real quick. I'll read them out and we'll kind of go from there. One of the question is, must we collect every compliance audit document we selected to audit and provide these documents in the compliance audit file as evidence? Example, if I randomly select 10% of our SOPs to audit, do I need to provide every one of those SOPs as evidence in the compliance audit files? The answer is no. In fact, in our compliance audits, we don't provide the checklist or anything else in the final report. What we do is we provide an overview of each of the elements and what we kind of looked at and how we determine compliance with that particular element. So for example, if we're looking for employer participation, we give a brief narrative as to what we looked at and how we determined compliance, and then we determined whether or not there are any gaps. And if there were a gap, we made recommendations. If there were none, we simply said we did not note anything as part of the audit process. Now, each auditor audits a little bit different. They might have their own checklists, their own protocols, et cetera, how they perform those audits. So that is not the important thing. The important thing is to make sure that you've audited each element, that you have a proper protocol that you used, et cetera. The problem comes into the fact that let's say that you have completed an audit, you didn't provide any documentation as to that you looked at that item, but yet a third-party auditor, or even OSHA for that matter, or EPA, comes in and they do an audit and they find issues with that particular element. Well, obviously, the third party or the person that did the audit beforehand didn't do a very thorough job if EPA and OSHA are finding gaps, right? Because they're looking for pretty much the low-hanging fruit. So if you cannot show compliance for those items now, then your previous auditors missed a number of things, or you didn't address the items that that previous auditor had found. Another question we have is, how can we demonstrate to senior leadership if we don't spend X amount of dollars to address an issue that it could possibly cost X amount of dollars as a result of fines? Is there such an example or template to put in black and white? I wish there was a good example of this, because I see this quite often. Let me tell you this, and this is one thing that I tell facilities all the time, management, CEOs, plant managers, et cetera. I tell this all the time. Yes, a OSHA citation, a serious citation might be $13,000. And let's say that you get 10 of those. So that's a $130,000 fine. It might cost something that may cost you $150,000 to fix all of those things. So 130,000 versus 150,000 actually have a return on investment there of 10 by not doing it. 10% return on investment roughly for not doing that. However, I will guarantee you, and I know of at least 3 facilities in the last 2 years that are no longer in business as a result of an incident that occurred when they didn't do those things that they knew they should have done. The reason they're not in business, somebody got hurt, somebody off-site was exposed. Believe me, those are going to run into millions of dollars easily. If you've had or been involved or came to my webinar where I talked about the cost of compliance, I addressed that one, and maybe we can address that one and do that webinar again where we talk about the cost of compliance. We think the cost of compliance is mainly what it costs us to do PSM, what it costs us to do RMP. Those things don't cost us that much at all. What really costs us in the long run is not doing those things, especially when we have somebody that gets hurt, that gets exposed, maybe even is a result of a fatality. Those things are millions and millions of dollars you can never recover, not only financially, but also in your reputation. That never recovers. The next question I have is do you have an opinion on where OSHA is headed in the Biden era? I will tell you this, that they are already ramping up in terms of the number of employees that they're trying to hire. I'd heard that that number is already, I'm just talking about the PSM side. What they're trying to do is hire people with PSM, process safety management experience. And I already heard that that number is up to 100 people that they're looking for. So right now, I think from a PSM, people that are dedicated to PSM, they only have 10 of those within the whole OSHA organization. So that's a huge increase in the number of people that they're looking at, strictly from a PSM standpoint. One of the items that I talked about in the previous webinar is I talked about how many facilities there are and how many facilities OSHA has been doing over the last, every year, I should say, how many PSM facilities OSHA targeted to get done every year. So each region was supposed to do at least 6 PSM compliance audits a year. That was the target, okay? So if you go with 9, 10, depending on where you're at, 11 regions, that's only about less than 100 facilities a year that would get an OSHA PSM audit, compliance audit. There are thousands of facilities, so it would take years to get through all of the facilities. So by them ramping up the number of OSHA PSM type inspectors, they want to up that number apparently. Next question it has is, a third-party auditor, do you require your customers to submit corrective actions to yourself as a follow-up, or just take in granted that the facility will do it? Normally, I do not require that they follow up. However, as part of the service, obviously that we provide, we can ask them if they need some help or assistance. And I will tell you that probably 80% of the time when we do an audit, we do have follow-up from our clients saying, well, you indicated that this is an issue. How do you recommend we respond, or would you recommend, how do we address? We normally provide that free of charge. We, helping people to get better at PSM and process safety is really what we want to achieve. Just the same reason we're doing these webinars. We don't charge for these webinars because we want people to learn process safety. It helps us as an industry to get better as well. All of us, I think most industries are struggling right now. The more we can help one another, I think the better. So yes, we'll help them address those items, not to make more money, but obviously if we're going to spend hours and actually write their procedures, write policies and procedures, yeah, we're going to charge for that. But just to answer simple questions, make sure that they understand which direction that they need to go and what is the better solution, will certainly help that. That doesn't cost them a cent for that. Okay, let's see. I think that's all of the questions, unless we have any more. I hope also, I don't know if you all got the message, but we'll be doing a webinar next week, February 18th, where we'll discuss the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals decision regarding PSM coverage. And it's called the Wynnewood decision. As most of you may know, I was with OSHA for about 5 years, doing mainly, all I did was PSM, teaching, training, coaching, mentoring, in PSM as it relates to all of our industries that applies to. This was one of those incidents that I was involved in, and of course resulted in a number of citations that were issued, and this one went through all of the courts, the lower courts, to the OSHA Review Commission, and then finally to the 10th Circuit of Appeals, where the decision was made to affirm most of those citations. So we're going to be doing a webinar on that, just talking about what that means, if anything, to the facilities that PSM applies to. So encourage you to come join us for that. Be myself and Robert Ayers with Hart, Holland and Hart, and we work with them on some of with their clients to make sure that their PSM programs are where they need to be. And so we'll be discussing that decision next week. If we don't have any more questions, I certainly appreciate all of you for joining us for this series. And feel free to give us any feedback that you might have, any way that we can help you to get better in process safety. That's what we want to do. I know that we're working on our next series and trying to make sure that that moves us and moves the ball forward in terms of process safety and knowledge for each of you. And I would encourage you again to stay tuned. We'll send out some notifications. We're ready to start that next series, which may include also some blended learning. What we're trying to do is make sure that we're providing some learning along with that. Again, these are all kind of free for you to make sure that we're all advancing our knowledge in process safety. Thank you all, and I appreciate it. And feel free again, email me if you have any questions. I'll be glad to answer.